14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep a free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all of your future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to recommend Volume 1 of Simon Schama's History of Britain, based on the television series, which, when I watched it about a decade ago, no doubt planted a little seed in the back of my mind that maybe I'd like to write a comprehensive history of something someday. I loved the history of Britain. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who's singing. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 115, Phase 2 complete. As the 260s drew to a close, the political order of the Roman Empire had begun to settle a bit. Postumus was in charge of the West, administering the provinces in Gaul and Hispania and Britain, while out in the East, Odenathus had carved out a sphere of influence for himself that kept the citizens of Syria, Palestine, and Asia Minor free from worries about another Sassanid invasion. Probably steaming about the loss of influence on the outer rims of his empire, Gallienus, nonetheless, dedicated himself to the governance of the Middle Empire, and in addition to fending off the Goths, he tried to strengthen the internal economy and even promote some of the long-neglected arts and sciences. After so much chaos and uncertainty and violence, a new equilibrium had been achieved. It was not a perfect equilibrium. After all, none of the external menaces to the empire had been vanquished, they had just been temporarily stalled. And the empire itself, well, there were now 3 of them, weren't there? Not that it mattered, the new equilibrium is about to be shattered. It was out in the east that the balance first began to slip. Odenathus, like a latter-day Alexander or Caesar, had come out of nowhere with a personality so strong and a skill set so superior to his contemporaries that it was almost like he was playing on a different level than everyone else. It is not hyperbole to say that following the capture of Valerian in 260, the Eastern Empire stood on the brink of permanent occupation. Maybe the still immense resources of the Roman Empire would have fended off the Sassanids, but those resources had been halved by the breakaway of the western provinces, and the rest were being spent on the defense of the Danube. There seemed to be nothing standing in the Persians' way. Sure, Macrianus and Ballista had run a fairly successful guerrilla defense, but was there anything anyone could put in the field to actually beat Shapur in battle? The answer, as it turned out, was yes, and the answer was Odenathus. Right when it seemed like the end was nigh, the Palmyrene prince had swept in, and not only delivered a decisive victory against the Sassanid army, but he held them at bay for the next 7 years, just when moments before, it seemed that there was nothing that could even trip Shapur up, let alone keep him home. Odenathus was, during the 260s, the indispensable man in the Eastern Empire. Without him, all would be lost. But of course, you know what de Gaulle said about indispensable men. The backdrop for the final chapter of the life of Odenathus was the 267 invasion of the Roman Empire by the Goths. In successive waves, they began pouring south by land and by sea, and no one seemed able to stop them. Thus far, Odenathus had naturally focused his attention on the east, as the Sassanids were his main concern. But seaborne Goths were now harrying the Black Sea coast of Asia Minor, and threatening the lands beyond the Taurus Mountains, which Odenathus considered part of his mandate. So, for the first time, he began making preparations to leave the eastern front and head north to face the Goths. But he never would get to face them. The indispensable man of the East did not die in battle or succumb to plague or go out in a blaze of glory. Instead, it seems that he fell victim to an assassin who was inspired mostly by a personal humiliation. The story that's most commonly related is that while off on a hunt with his royal entourage, Odenathus' nephew breached some bit of protocol, Maybe he took the first shot at something, or maybe he refused to allow some prized target to be taken by his uncle. Whatever he did, he was subsequently either chastised in too harsh of terms publicly, or possibly put in some kind of timeout when the party returned home. Whatever his offense and whatever his resentment, and at a family celebration a short time later, the nephew, probably by way of poison, killed Odenathus and his eldest son. The nephew's role in the sudden and shocking death of the Lord of Palmyra was soon discovered, and he was put to death by Odenathus' now widow, Zenobia. A variation of the story has it that Zenobia herself was behind the murder so that her son Vabalithus would have a clear path to power. In this telling, the older son who died along with Odenathus was from Odenathus' previous marriage, and was thus standing between Vabalithus and the throne. Given the fact that this follows the familiar wicked stepmother trope that the Romans so love, modern historians typically discount this version. Another version has it that Gallienus instigated the murder because he feared the growing power of Palmyra. But this too is usually dismissed for a number of different reasons, the main one being that the death of the protector of the East opened up Gallienus' flank to the Sassanids right at the moment when he was preparing to go fight a major campaign against the Goths. Maybe if the murder had occurred when there was less imminent danger to the empire, we could indulge in that particular conspiracy theory. But really, Gallienus killing Odenathus at that moment would have been the height of folly. In the immediate aftermath of Odenathus' death, there was a great deal of confusion about who was now in charge. Odenathus' authority had been a personally held grant from Gallienus. So, did power now devolve back to the Roman governors, or did Odenathus' son inherit his father's titles? With everyone just kind of looking at everyone else, Zenobia stepped forward and simply acted as if her husband's death meant that of course Vabalithus would inherit all the power ceded to the family by Gallienus. But of course, since Vabalithus was still a young child, Zenobia herself would have to act as regent, which means that unless you have a mind to stop me, I am now in charge around here. With shrewd political sensibilities and the backing of one of her husband's top generals, an experienced soldier named Zabdus, Zenobia was able to assume all the powers Odenathus had claimed before any other rival could even muster a counterclaim. Tied up on the Danube with the Gothic invasion, Gallienus couldn't spare the time or attention it would take to weigh in on the subject. He did send a trusted lieutenant east to make sure that the queen understood who was really in charge, but, signaling who she thought was really in charge, the emissary was treated with less dignity than a man of his rank would have expected, and he soon packed up and left in an angry huff over Zenobia's calculated haughtiness. This snubbing of Gallienus' men would eventually reveal itself to be the first step in Zenobia's long-term plan to establish a hold on what was slowly turning from the Eastern Roman Empire into the new independent Palmyrene Empire. As I just mentioned though, Gallienus was too caught up with his own problems to deal with Zenobia's power play. Those problems were the same problems that Odenathus had been gearing up to face when he died. The massive Gothic invasion of 267. After watching some of their brothers achieve great success using a small fleet to pillage the Black Sea coast, a collection of Gothic tribes decided that what had worked on a small scale would work even better on a large scale. So they built or commandeered some 500 ships, and in early 267 they set sail south from the estuary of the Dniester River, without much more of a plan than to see what came along and then take it. They made their way down the west coast of the Black Sea and decided that they hadn't quite had their fill yet, so they passed into the Bosphorus with an eye on taking Byzantium. When the city proved to be a tougher nut to crack than they had hoped, though according to some sources they did indeed crack the nut eventually, they continued south through the Sea of Marmara and then made an attempt on the city of Cyzicus. Gallienus and the Romans were not sitting around idly as this Gothic fleet sacked the coastal cities of the empire, and the imperial navy based in Ravenna was launched on a mission to sink the invading barbarians. The Roman navy caught the Goths as they were occupied with Cyzicus, and the Goths, not being the best sailors in the world, were scattered by the much more competent Roman sailors. Though the naval battle in the Sea of Marmara was a decisive Roman victory, a sizable collection of Gothic ships managed to escape through the Hellespont intact. So, despite their best efforts, the Romans still found themselves scrambling after a Gothic army now loose in the Aegean Sea. As they sailed into the heart of Greece, the remaining Goths split into two groups, with one heading due south towards Crete and then Rhodes, while the other made for the mainland. It had been a good long time since the Greeks had had to deal with any kind of foreign threat, and the citizens of Athens and Sparta and the other old Greek city-states were shocked to find themselves suddenly scrambling to build walls around their cities in an attempt to fend off the Goths. The defense of Athens was led by a man named Dexippus, who, in the tradition of Xenophon and Thucydides, was a historian as well as a soldier and a statesman. Though only fragments of his work remain today, back when they were all still whole, late antiquity scholars relied heavily on the Greek historian's writings, which means that we owe him a debt of gratitude for helping shed at least some light on the convoluted 3rd century. When the Goths came knocking, though, helping some beleaguered future scholars was probably the last thing on Dexippus's mind. The Goths had appeared so suddenly that there was very little the Athenians could do to prevent the barbarians from overrunning their city, and Dexippus's fame as a soldier was earned not by preventing the Goths from sacking Athens, but instead by managing to revive the spirits of his neighbors and lead them in a decisive counterattack that finally drove the plundering Goths off. When they were done with Athens, the barbarians had headed south to the Peloponnese, where they sacked, among others, the city of Sparta. But as they headed back north, they were met by an army of irregulars raised by Dexippus, who put the surprised Goths into a hasty flight and drove them north right into the waiting embrace of Gallienus' approaching army. When he returned home, Dexippus found Athens was now a smoldering ruin. But, according to the famous anecdote, he also found that the great library had been left untouched. One of the Gothic chiefs had seen his men preparing to burn it down and put a stop to their plan, telling them that it was better to leave the Greeks preoccupied with their books so that they did not resume their previous warlike ways. When the imperial navy had sailed off to confront the Gothic fleet, Gallienus organized an army comprised of his mobile cavalry, the Praetorian cohorts, and units from the Danube legions. While the Goths sacked Greece, Gallienus was speeding in from the west. He might not have been able to save the Greeks, but he could certainly smack down the marauding barbarians when they inevitably made their way back north to their homelands on the far side of the Danube. Now, I'm sure you're as sick of hearing this as I am saying it, but guess what? There's some confusion in the record about what happened next. The accepted version is that Gallienus intercepted the group who had been driven off by Dexippus and defeated them in a battle near the city of Nessus in Thrace. The problem is that Claudius Gothicus would win a very similar battle the next year, near the very similar sounding city of Nisus, leading some to suppose that something might have gotten mixed